Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar, and I am here to answer all of your questions about J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, whatever you guys got for me. If you want to ask me a question, you can do so in the comments if you'd like, and I try to get to as many of those as I can. Or if you want to be featured in a video, really the only way to do that is to write up a good question and to put it on Quora. And there is a link to my Quora account in the description of this video and every other video on this channel. Ask your question there. Tag me in it. It will actually ask you, well, you could directly ask me a question from my page, but it will ask you when you've written a question who you want to tag. My name will show up on that list as well. Just look for me, John Sierra. If you don't have a Quora account, it's really easy to make one, and actually you probably already do have one because you can sign up with Facebook and such. That's the way I did it. Ignore that. That's a Java update available. Who cares? Okay, so before we get to the questions, let's do a bit of a reading. And this time I have decided that we're going to read a bit from Beren and Lúthien. Just one second here. Oh, sorry about that. Things are popping up that I have to get rid of. I did just reboot the computer. So let's see. Actually, this is a good part right here. Let's do this one. At the time, however, whereof the tale tells, it was Tevildo's chief desire to recapture Beren and Tinuviel and to slay Huan, that he might regain the spell and magic he had lost, for he was in great fear of Melko. And he dared not seek his master's aid and reveal his defeat in the betrayal of his spell. Unwitting of this, Huan feared those places, and was in great dread lest those doings come swiftly to Melko's ear, as did most things that came to pass in the world. Wherefore now Tinuviel and Beren wandered far away with Huan, and they became great in friendship with him. And in that life Beren grew strong again, and his thraldom fell from him, and Tinuviel loved him. Yet wild and rugged and very lonely were those days, for never a face of elf or man did they see, and Tinuviel grew at last to long sorely for Gwendoling, her mother, and the songs of sweet magic she was used to sing to her children as twilight fell in the woodlands by their ancient halls. Often she half fancied she heard the flute of Daeron her brother in pleasant glades wherein they sojourned, and her heart grew heavy. At length she said to Beren and to Huan, I must return home. And now it is Beren's heart that is overcast with sorrow, for he loved that life in the woods with the dogs. For by now many others had become joined to Huan. Yet not if Tinuviel were not there. None the less, say he, never may I go back with thee to the land of Artenur, nor come there ever after to seek thee, sweet Tinuviel, save only bearing a Silmaril. Nor may that ever now be achieved, for I am not a fugitive from these very halls of Melko, and in danger of the most evil pains do any of his servants spy me. Now this he said in the grief of his heart at parting with Tinuviel, and she was torn in mind, abiding not the thought of leaving Beren, nor yet of living ever thus in exile. So sat she a great while in sad thought, and she spoke not. But Beren sat nigh at length, and said, Tinuviel, one thing only can we do. Go get a Silmaril. And she sought thereupon Huan, asking his aid and advice. But he was very grave, and saw nothing but folly in the matter. Yet in the end Tinuviel begged of him the fell of Oikoroi that he slew in the affray of the glade. Now Oikoroi was a very mighty cat, and Huan carried that fell with him as a trophy. Now doth Tinuviel put forth her skill in fairy magic, and she sews Beren into this fell, and makes him to the likeness of a great cat. And she teaches him how to sit and sprawl, to step and bound and trot in the semblance of a cat, till Huan's very whiskers bristled at the sight, and thereat Beren and Tinuviel laughed. Never, however, could Beren learn to screech or wail or to purr like any cat that ever walked, nor could Tinuviel awaken a glow in the dead eyes of the catskin. But we must put up with that, said she, and thou hast the air of a very noble cat, if thou but hold thy tongue. So this is actually from a very early... This is the novelized form of Beren and Lúthien. If you've ever read Beren and Lúthien in the Silmarillion, it's not the same. It's not the same story. It's not told the same. It's very, very different. And there's a good reason for that. This is a very, very early version. There's actually a few different versions in here. You get the prose poem. You get the main version. You get a couple of other ones here as well. But what's interesting is in this very early version, you hear a lot of these character names, and some of them may not reconcile with the Silmarillion, but you can see basically they're on a quest for the Silmaril, not because of Elúthingol telling Beren that he must do this to marry Lúthien, who is called Tinuviel at this point, but it is their idea to do so that he may return to civilization, because he does not wish to do that. There's a few other things. She has a brother named Dairon, and her mother's name was Gwendoling. Of course, we know her mother's name as Melian, and that she did not have a brother. Melkor, or Morgoth, is called Melko. Sauron is a cat named Tevildo. There's a whole lot of different things going on. Huan speaks a lot more. So it's more of a fairy story. Speaking of which, Tinuviel, or Lúthien in this version, is a fairy. Sometimes she's referred to as an elf. But she's a fairy. Beren is the elf in this situation, so it's really quite different. But anyway, let's get to your questions. We have 17 questions to get through today. Okay, and we're going to start off with... Oh, you know what? To answer this one, I need some books. Because I need to demonstrate something for you. But anyway, here's the first question. This came in from Jeffrey Claburn, who asked, what is your favorite story in the Silmarillion or Unfinished Tales? So I'm going to give you one for each, but they're really the same story. It is the Dark Tale of Turin Turambar. So if we look at it here, here's the Silmarillion, and which is a fairly new copy. Here's Unfinished Tales. Not a very new copy, quite beat up, but I'm fond of it, rather. And the way that we used to read this story is you would bring up Unfinished Tales, and you would go to the second story in the first section. The first section is, of course, there's 4 sections to this. There's the first age, the second age, the third age, and then there's sort of a miscellany at the end where it doesn't apply to specific ages. But anyway, you would go to page 45 here, where it says Narn I Hin Húrin, or the Tale of the Children of Húrin. And you would read that up until a certain point. And I believe the point that you would stop at is where Turin Turambar, and his... here it is. And his band of outlaws had come to live with Mim the petty dwarf. And you would end it with here. So began the abiding of Turin, son of Húrin, to the halls of Mim, in Beren and Lúthien, the house of ransom. And then right there it says, for the story of Turin from his coming to Beren and Lúthien to the fall of Nargothrond, see the Silmarillion, page 204 to 215, and the appendix to Narn I Húrin, page 142 below. So you'd have to go back to the Silmarillion, open to that page, read the next bit, then go to the appendix and read a bit there, and then return back here and read the rest of the story. Thankfully, we don't have to do that anymore, because in 2007, they published the novel version, which is everything that you need all in one thing, and is quite wonderful. That is easily my favorite Tolkien story. It's collectively known as The Children of Húrin. It used to be spread across 2 books. And you would have to follow those instructions. Thankfully, we have the standalone novel now, which is my preferred way of reading it. I would also give an honorable mention to the tale of Turin's cousin, Tur, which is also told across both books, starting in Unfinished Tales of Tur and his coming to Gondolin, and then continuing in the Silmarillion of Tur and the fall of Gondolin, except that they're really sort of 2 different versions of the tale. It's quite confusing. But if you start with Unfinished Tales, and then you go to Silmarillion, you will get the full story. There is a standalone book, The Fall of Gondolin, that gives you pretty much every version of the Fall of Gondolin tale, and the last one is the last one that he was working on, but he never finished it, which is why it's in Unfinished Tales. But you could sort of pick up where he arrives at Gondolin at the end of the Unfinished Tales version, and then go to the Silmarillion and read the rest of it. But there you have it. Those are sort of my two favorites there. Okay, next question. All right, let's see. This one's anonymous. In Tolkien's books, Sam wears the One Ring and uses invisibility to rescue Frodo from the Tower of Cirith Ungol in Mordor. If the ring corrupts the bearer, why then didn't Sam go with Frodo to the Grey Havens? It's not really about because the ring corrupts. I mean, that was a little bit of it to a certain extent for Frodo and for Bilbo, and the pain and everything that they went through. Sam was pretty unscathed, but and he was entitled, though, because he was a ring bearer, he was entitled to sail to the west, but he didn't go right away. He had a life to lead. While all the surviving bearers of the One Ring were invited to the uttermost west, we have to realize that there's 3 of them, and that one of them is very different from the others. So let's look at them. Bilbo was 131 years of age, the oldest hobbit who ever lived. And even though physically he would have been like in his 70s, his mental faculties were declining. He was ready to go on a final adventure and leave Middle-earth. Frodo was deeply traumatized by the events of the War of the Ring. He suffered from sickness, pain, and he was haunted by the loss of the ring. He would never be fully healed without leaving Middle-earth, and he could never live a normal life. And then we have Sam, who had just gotten married and started a new family. You see the difference? It's a very different situation for Sam. He had a life to live, and he sure did. He was mayor of Michel Delving for 49 years. He had 13 children, and he did eventually sail to the west, but only at a very old age after his wife Rose had passed away. Okay, next question. How did Sméagol become so addicted to the ring so fast, and Frodo didn't as fast? There's really 2 reasons why the ring affected Sméagol differently than it affected Frodo, or Bilbo for that matter, or Isildur for that matter. The first is the method by which the One Ring came into his possession. In the case of Frodo, it was left to him by his cousin Bilbo, who was leaving the Shire. It was not easy for Bilbo to give up the One Ring. He needed a lot of assistance and some sternness from Gandalf to do so. Either way, it was passed peacefully, and it was not without a host for very long, a few hours at most. With Sméagol and Déagol, however, the one had been underwater for a very long time, and it was in desperate need of a host. There were 2 there. There was Sméagol and Déagol, and only one hand may wear a ring. So the ring really had to pour on the malice to get them to fight to the death, so that the weaker one would be out of the way, and the ring would be bore by the stronger of the 2. The second reason is much simpler. Sméagol's a jerk. Tolkien described in one of his letters, letter 214, he called both of these remigrant stores miserable specimens. That was the exact words he used. And he said that Déagol was a mean little soul and Sméagol was worse. They were not good people, and they were much easier to corrupt. And they were already both mutually upset with each other before they had even found the ring. Déagol, it was Sméagol's birthday. Déagol was forced to get him a birthday present, and he wasn't happy about having to get Sméagol a birthday present, and Sméagol didn't like the present. He found it to be quite unsatisfactory. So with there being 2 of them, they're not good people, one of them stronger than the other, it's no wonder that it escalated to murder very quickly, especially considering that the one had been without a host for a very long time. Okay, good question, though. Okay, so next question. This one came in from, I know who wrote this one. Okay. Oh, boy. All right, so there's a fellow on Quora by the name of Justin Glassband who writes a lot of questions, and he tags me in very many of them. And Justin writes a lot of questions that I would categorize as nonsense. It's a lot of things like, well, what if the Fellowship of the Ring were replaced by 9 Navy SEALs, or what if Aragorn had a machine gun, or and there was a lot of like, well, with the Eagles and the Ash Mountains and all this stuff, and it really is just like not the kind of thing that I want to encourage, but every once in a while Justin comes up with something really good, and I want to encourage that. So I don't ignore him. I just try to take the questions that I think are good questions and answer those and encourage him to ask questions like that and not really pay attention to the other ones. So this is a good question from Justin, and he did a really good job at this one. How did the Nazgûl in The Lord of the Rings feel? Were there still kings underneath who were controlled like zombies and aware of what was happening, or were they totally brainwashed? So this is a good question. This is the sort of thing I do want to encourage. Please give me more of this and less of what if Aragorn had a machine gun, because that's not interesting to me. So the answer here is they're totally brainwashed. It's a little bit of both, but they're mostly just completely brainwashed. Their will has been stripped away, and their will is completely gone. There is very little of their individual personalities left. That's not to say that they were controlled like zombies. I think we're getting a little thunder because I'm hearing it. It could be the song though. It could be a very low sort of like bass drum though. But they were more like less like zombies and more like devotees. And the object of their devotion was Sauron. The Rings of Power was largely kind of a failure for Sauron. The elves refused to wear them. The dwarves were affected in a minor way, but they didn't fall under Sauron's control like he was hoping. But with men, he found success. That's definitely the song. Sauron learned from his past mistakes, and instead of trying to control good people, he simply offered power to foul people. Tolkien stated the Nine were tyrants and necromancers. The Nazgûl are capable of acting independently from Sauron, but they're not capable of doing anything that is not his will. An example would be the Witch King taking over a part of Arnor and creating his own kingdom, which was called Angmar. Sauron would have approved of that. They are, though, so devoted to him that if they came to recover the One Ring, if they managed to get it from Frodo, they would fully, freely, and willingly give it to Sauron. They wouldn't try to hold on to it. They can act on their own, but they cannot defy Sauron. They're sort of the perfect servants in this sense. They're smart enough and resourceful enough to act alone, but completely devoted to Sauron and bound to Sauron. Okay. Let's see. Next question. Okay. This one's anonymous, unfortunately. But so this question is, I am 18. Is it too late for me to read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings? I haven't watched the movies or read the book. Oh, my sweet summer child. Don't let anyone strangle your inner child, and don't let yourself do it. Don't do it to yourself. The Hobbit is... I have my copy right here. Where's The Hobbit? You know, I just read it just a few months ago, all the way through, of course, and I've done readings from it on here. Oh, that's The Lord of the Rings. That's not helpful. Where the heck is The Hobbit? Oh, here we are. It was still in the box set. So here's my copy of The Hobbit. I don't know quite what happened here. All the other ones in the box set were preserved perfectly, but there's The Hobbit. There's my copy. It's a tale suitable for children. This does not mean that it's strictly for children, like in a clubhouse with an endearingly crudely made sign that says no adults allowed or no grown-ups or something. Think of The Hobbit as G-rated in the most pure sense of G-rated. General audiences. It's not a children's tale. It's a tale that children can enjoy. Or if that doesn't strike you quite right, perhaps I could say it's rated E for everyone. Children are included, but the target audience is everyone. Now, The Lord of the Rings, that might fall into the category that in modern parlance would be young adult novel. I read it when I was around 10 or so initially, but I also read through the entirety of it, including The Hobbit, just like I said, just a few months ago. I'm 43. Okay, well, I was 42 when I did it because I had my birthday since then. But what I'm saying is it's not too late for you or for anybody. Tolkien had a very different approach to children than many authors, even of this time or his time, had. He didn't pander to children. He respected them. He thought that media aimed at children, or including children is more appropriate to say, should respect their intelligence and actually be, good. Now, in the past, I've done some film critique. Okay, I've done a lot of film critique, actually. And I reviewed an animated film that was for children once. And I didn't like it. I was rather scathing in my critique. It was bad. I don't even remember what movie it was, but I just remember it was a children's movie, and it was very bad. And I gave it a poor review. And I got a lot of flack for that. And the common thread in what people were saying to me was, it's a kid's movie, what do you expect? Well, I expect it to be better. That's what I expect. There is good children's media out there. It's the type that adults can watch without wanting to, die inside a little or a lot. Just because something is made for children or made for everyone and thus being suitable for children doesn't mean that it should not be held to any kind of scrutiny, that it shouldn't have something to say, or that it shouldn't be of a superior quality. This was my point, and the point of Tolkien as well. Tolkien would probably vomit in rage if he saw something like Baby Shark, and that being what passes for children's entertainment. And he would probably weep that anyone would think that it's too late to read The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. So yeah, just read. I hope you enjoy it. Okay. Actually, I wanted to bring that back for a moment because Cora is telling me something. I didn't notice it at first, but it says that the question previously had details. They are now in a comment. So if I want to see that, I have to go, I believe, here, and then scroll down and see if I can find this comment. Unfortunately, I'm seeing mostly people's comments, but not the author's comments. A lot of people decided to answer this. Okay, well, whatever. I'm not going to bother with that. Okay, next question. Who or what is the equivalent to God in The Lord of the Rings in Middle-earth? The equivalent to God would be God. Tolkien didn't create a fictional character to be God in this world, and he just had his characters come up with names for God. And I think that he would sort of rankle a little. He wouldn't approve of saying equivalent to God, because he would tell you there is nobody that is equivalent to God. So God in Tolkien's world is called Eru, which is Elvish, and it means the one, or Ilúvatar, which is also Elvish, and it means father of all. Tolkien was rather insistent that Ilúvatar was indistinguishable from the God of Abraham. And by that metric, he did not create the character. He borrowed him and gave him names in Elvish. Okay, next question. All right, let's see. I know the love story between an elf and a dwarf in Lord of the Rings was fake. Were there any stories of love between an elf and a dwarf? I think you're referring not to the Lord of the Rings, but to the Hobbit, because there was the sort of like strange love triangle they did with the original character, who was named Tauriel, and of course Legolas was sort of pining for her, but then she fell in love with Kili the dwarf, and then of course he dies, and it's all very sad and everything. That wasn't the Lord of the Rings. That was the Hobbit. There were not any traditional love stories like you would think of between an elf and a dwarf, but there was Gimli and Galadriel. So Gimli and Galadriel were never going to be a couple. There's like a lot of reasons why. Elves and dwarves don't marry each other. They're not really compatible in that way. And Galadriel was already married. She had a husband named Celeborn. But Gimli still fell in love with her and displayed what we would call courtly love, which is when a man openly displays his affection in appropriate ways for a woman that is out of reach, such as she's of a high stature or she's already married. We see Gimli out there defending her honor, going so far as to threaten Éomer for speaking ignorantly about Galadriel. Galadriel was likely used to this sort of thing. Celebrimbor, in some versions of the story, was said to be in love with Galadriel and gave her the Elisar because of that. So, she was already married, but he displayed his love with gifts and keeping an appropriate distance. So that's the sort of love between a dwarf and an elf that was put into Tolkien's works. Okay, next question. What is the nature of Smaug the dragon in The Hobbit? Is he considered a good or a bad dragon in Middle-earth? There aren't any good dragons in Middle-earth. They're all bad. Glaurung was the first dragon. He was created by Morgoth, and he was basically an extension of Morgoth's will. He spoke with Morgoth's voice. He saw with Morgoth's gaze. Dragons are a foul race created by Morgoth, and they were never good. Smaug is of a much lesser degree of evil than Glaurung. He's of a much lesser stature and power than Glaurung, and he's not being controlled by a satanic force, nor is he overly concerned with enacting cruelty, but his goals are simple avarice and occasionally reminding people who they're dealing with. He's not a good dragon. There are no good dragons. Not in Tolkien, anyway. Okay, next up. What language was spoken in Middle-earth? Was it a fictional language created by Tolkien, or was it based on a real language like Latin or Germanic? Germanic? I think you mean German. Or Germanic language. It depends on who was doing the talking and where they lived. There were a lot of languages in The Lord of the Rings that were spoken. Of course, it was also translated into English, except where it's not for effect. The common speech that is represented as English in Tolkien's work is called Westron. That's not to say that it is English. It's a completely separate language from English, but when the characters speak English in the book, it has been, quote-unquote, translated from Westron. Hobbitish is a specific rural Western dialect. Dwarves have a secret language that is their own, that's called Khuzul. Elves speak a lot of languages. The most common are Quenya and Sindarin, but there's also Telerin, and there's various other dialects out there. The orcs have their own dialects, orcish dialects, and there's the black speech of Mordor. Gondor speaks both Sindarin, which is an elvish language, and Adunec, which is a language from Numenor. There are a lot of languages. There's Rohanese, there's the language of the Druidan, there's all sorts, really. So there's tons and tons of languages in the Lord of the Rings and its related stories. Okay, next question. What does Sauron consume for sustenance in his spirit form after his defeat from the destruction of the One Ring? Okay, so basically what we're getting at is, what did Sauron eat in that form? Sauron, in any form, does not need to eat. He does not require sustenance. He's not alive in the same sense that men are alive, or that elves are alive, or dwarves or hobbits are alive. Nor is he a primal spirit or an elemental like Ungoliant or Tom Bombadil or Goldberry, all of whom eat. He is of the Ainur. Ainur means holy ones. They're essentially angels. While the Ainur are often described as spirits, and the other spirits I mentioned are just always described as either eating or being hungry, the Ainur, they're angels. They're angelic in nature, and they predate the world, they predate the universe, the very concept of food and the concept of time. That being said, it does not mean that any given Ainu cannot eat, just that they don't need to. The Valar were known to hold festivals and feasts and invite the elves, and of course there are those who become incarnate, such as Melian when she wedded Ilúthingol, or the wizards. In this case, they are bound to real bodies, and those real bodies need fuel, so those they have to eat. Melian had to eat, Gandalf had to eat, Saruman had to eat, Radagast had to eat, so on, so on, so on. But for the likes of the Valar or a Maiar that's not incarnate like Sauron, Sauron's body, which is called a fauna, is really like a cloak, and he could cast it off and be in his true naked form without being diminished. Just like somebody could take off their clothes, they are not made less. Now, Fourth Age Sauron was diminished, though, due to the destruction of the One Ring, and he was too weak to be able to form another fauna and regain physical form. But even in this diminished state, he's still an angel, and he really doesn't need food or any sort of sustenance. Okay, next question. Let's see. Oh, here's the one from the thumbnails. Who were all the ring bearers in The Lord of the Rings? So ring bearer is a nebulous term, I think. Many characters bear rings. Which ones do you mean? Do you mean the One Ring? Do you mean the Rings of Power? There's other rings out there. I'll answer the ones that I think you're probably referring to, which would be the One Ring and the Rings of Power. So not just any other ring, like, say, the Ring of Barahir, which Aragorn had that one, but that's not a ring of power. So I can go over these as best we can. So the One Ring, this is easy. There's a direct, we'll probably say, a chain of custody with no mysteries. Sauron created the ring, and he was the first bearer. After he was defeated by Elendil and Gil-galad, Elendil's son, Isildur cut the ring from his hand, and he bore it next. Now, the One Ring abandoned Isildur as he swam in the Gladden, attempting to escape the disaster of the Gladden fields, and it lay at the bottom of the river until it was discovered by a remigrant store named Diegol. Diegol was shortly after murdered by Sméagol, who we know better as Gollum, who kept it for a very long time, the longest aside from Sauron. The One Ring abandoned Gollum, and it was found by Bilbo, who kept it until he was convinced to give it up by Gandalf. He left it to his cousin Frodo. Frodo kept it until its destruction, though a few others handled it for brief moments. Gandalf held the ring for a brief moment when he was examining it. Bombadil played with it for a little while before giving it back to Frodo. Sam bore it for a time when he thought Frodo was dead, but later he gave it back. Gollum forcibly took the ring back from Frodo at the end, and then he and the ring both fell into Samath Naur, destroying them both. The three rings are also easy to track. They were created by Celebrimbor, who then gave them to Gil-galad. Gil-galad entrusted one to Círdan and another to Galadriel, while keeping the last one for himself. Círdan surrendered his ring to Gandalf, and Gil-galad eventually passed his to Elrond before going to war against Sauron. Elrond, Gandalf, and Galadriel bore the rings into the west. The seven were all given to the Dwarf Lords, assuming one dwarf per clan. Most of the characters are unnamed, and they seem to pass the rings down in a dynastic sense. 4 of them were destroyed by dragons, and the other 3 were eventually recovered by Sauron. One we know came from Thrain and was likely passed down from Thror, and you could trace the lineage back to the time when the rings were handed out. The 3 were all the nine. We already did the 3. The 9 were all given to men. Of these, we only know the name of one, Camel the Easterling. The term Easterling is nebulous at best. It referred at one point to the wild men of Rhovanion, and then later on the men of Rhûn. None of the others are named, though the chief Nazgûl was given the title the Witch King, and he was said to be a man of Númenor. Of the 9, several of them were from Númenor, but others may have been Easterling or Haradrim or really anybody. Okay, next question. What did a younger Gandalf look like? This depends on your definition of younger. Gandalf speaks of his youth in the West, before he was Gandalf, and he came incarnated into Middle-earth. He was then known as Olorin. As a Mire spirit, he would look like whatever he wanted to look like. And it was said that Olorin often wished to be invisible in his naked spirit form, but when he did choose to show himself to the children of Ilúvatar, he disguised himself as an elf, so he looked like an elf. If you mean younger as in when he first arrived in Middle-earth, well, it's a little complicated, but I can explain it simply. We do know that the wizards definitely age. They are incarnated into real bodies, which do age, but they age very, very slowly. Círdan noted that the White Messenger, who we know as Saruman, had black hair when he arrived in the year 1000 of the Third Age. At the close of the Third Age, he was described as his hair going almost completely white. He had a little bit of black around his mouth, around his ears, so Saruman aged. Círdan also noted that when the wizards arrived, the Grey Messenger, who we know as Gandalf, looked older than the rest, and he was leaning on his staff. Gandalf chose a much older body than the rest. He never looked young, or even middle-aged, like the rest would have. Círdan gave Gandalf his ring Narya, stating that Gandalf had taken a great burden onto himself, and that the ring will give him aid and comfort. It's very possible that the ring slowed down Gandalf's aging even further, or perhaps stopped it altogether and kept him much the same, and the rest of the wizards sort of caught up with him in the millennia since their arrival. Okay, next question. What happened to the vampires and werewolves that were featured prominently during the Middle-earth's First Age? I can't really say that they were featured prominently, but I can definitely talk about the werewolves at least. The only named vampire in Tolkien's Legendarium was Thringwithil. She was Sauron's messenger, and then there was Sauron himself, who could take the form of a vampire. I would hardly say that they were prominent. They may have, in fact, been extremely rare. It's possible that vampires could not propagate themselves and can only be created by necromancy, and Sauron only made a few, and they died out and they were never replenished. There are, however, still werewolves. I'm going to read a little small passage here from The Lord of the Rings. "I know," said Frodo, "they were terrible to behold. But why could we all see their horses? Because they are real horses, just as the black robes are real robes that they wear to give shape to their nothingness when they have dealings with the living. Then why do these black horses endure such riders? All other animals are terrified when they draw near, even the elf horse of Glorfindel. The dogs howl and the geese scream at them. Because these horses are born and bred in the service of the Dark Lord in Mordor. Not all his servants are chattels and wraiths. There are orcs and trolls, there are wargs and werewolves, and there have been, and still are, many men, warriors, and kings that walk alike under the sun, and yet are under his sway, and their number is growing daily." So, Glorfindel is because that's who Frodo was speaking to. Glorfindel's a little misinformed here, because the horses that the Nazgûl use are not actually born and bred in Mordor. They were stolen from Rohan and were trained in Mordor. Of course, Glorfindel doesn't have a reason to believe this. He doesn't have a reason to know this. He's heard that they're from Mordor, I guess. But that's beside the point. Glorfindel specifically mentions werewolves and wargs. Now, the wargs were introduced in The Hobbit. They might be relations of werewolves, which were themselves just very large wolves with spirits imbued into them by necromancy. It is possible that werewolves propagate, but the result are wargs, and the remaining werewolves are survivors of the First Age. Okay, next question. Did Gandalf ever consider giving up his immortality and becoming mortal, like Elrond and Galadriel? What? I have to answer this because that's really wild. The only one of these three that had any sort of ability to choose immortality was Elrond, and he already chose immortality. And the choice that he was given was a one-time only thing. It cannot be reversed. It's one or the other. This was due to the actions of his parents, Eärendil and Elwing, who were mortal half-elves who sailed west. They were forgiven for doing so, but they were made to choose whether they would be mortal and counted among men, or immortal or counted among the elves. They both chose immortality, and this choice was visited on their children and all their descendants who had at least one elvish parent. Elrond chose immortality. His twin brother Elros chose mortality. Galadriel is not a half-elf, and she's not descended from Eärendil or Elwing. She's older than them, and she has no ability to shed her immortality. The only elf without mortal heritage to shed mortality was Lúthien, and it's something that Tolkien explained was a direct act of God, a Lúvatar, as was Tuor, a man who had no elvish heritage, becoming immortal. Gandalf is not mortal, he's not immortal, he's eternal and divine. He's an Ainu, he's an angel. The body that he inhabits as Gandalf is a mortal body, but death didn't stop him, and his spirit must persist until the end of the world, and then beyond it, because he's Ainu. Okay, next question. What if someone in the Fellowship threw the ring into the well in Moria? This one came in from Hao Chen. If someone threw the one ring into the well in Moria, then they would have to retrieve it. Somebody would have to go after it and get it back. I mean, what? At the Council of Elrond, Glorfindel had an idea like that. So let's just throw the ring into the sea, so that no one could ever use it. Gandalf pointed out a few problems with that idea. For one, Sauron doesn't actually need the ring to win. It's not the key to his victory. It's the key to his defeat, since it's in their hands. And since it was in their hands, they had the opportunity to attempt to destroy it, and they must try to do that. They couldn't keep it safe. They couldn't use it. They couldn't toss it aside. Another issue is the One Ring was already at the bottom of a river for a really long time, and it managed to get itself found. There are creatures in the ocean, and not all of their natures are known. Tossing the ring in there would only allow Sauron to win by sheer military might, and even if he lost, he would return repeatedly. But he'd be putting off the problem by tossing the ring away to a future generation, to whoever found it. They needed to deal with it while the opportunity was there. Tossing it into the well in Moria is worse than tossing it into the ocean. It will get found a lot sooner, not by a fish or a mysterious sea creature, but by an orc or by the Balrog or by Gollum. So yeah, definitely not a good idea. Okay, next question. How would Fëanor have reacted if one of his sons refused to swear the oath? Not well. There was an alternate version of this story that was a proposed revision to the Silmarillion that Tolkien was working on. He didn't finish it. It didn't make it into the Silmarillion. But something similar happened in this. Now, in this version of the story, each son did still take the oath, but one of them had a change of heart. That story can be read in the book The Peoples of Middle-earth, and it's about Amrod. And Tolkien had revised to be Fëanor's youngest son instead of his second youngest son. And in this story, Amrod comes over to Middle-earth, but he's quite horrified by Fëanor's actions. And it should be mentioned that in this version, he's not called Amrod, he's called Telefinwe. So Telefinwe says that he will stay on the ship the first night instead of sleeping in discomfort on land. He says, I'm going to stay on the boat. It's comfortable there. It is thought that he was planning to take the ship and go back west to rejoin his mother. But of course, Fëanor, as in the story that we know, he burned the ships, and in this version he burned his son with the ship. And when he was asked, did you know that Telefinwe, your son, was on that ship? And he said, that was the first one I burned. So, of course, this is post-oath. So maybe somebody can make the argument that Fëanor was doing this because he was driven by the oath, but that's not really true. Telefinwe was not breaking the oath by sleeping on the ship, and they thought he was going to steal the ship and take it back, but he never actually said that or declared that he was going to do that in any way. Fëanor sends his son back to Aemon the hard way and the painful way, simply because of the impression that he might break the oath. That's pretty severe. So if Telefinwe or any of them really would have just not taken the oath to begin with, the very mildest thing that Fëanor would have done is disown his son, and to let him know in no uncertain terms that any attempt to stop him or hinder him in any way will be met with deadly force. Part of the oath was that kin were not exempt from being slain. Fëanor was not playing around. Okay, and we have one more here. This one came in from John Bassett, who asks, how was it that hobbits were able to resist the effects of the One Ring, whereas humans were corrupted by it immediately? That's not really true. There's no example of a human becoming instantly corrupted by the One Ring, as you describe, and any corruption shown was gradual. Out of all the bearers of the One Ring, the only man among them was Isildur. And he not only attempted to keep the ring, but tried to use it to dominate it and to bend it to his will. He found it quite painful to hold because of this. The ring actively fought him. In the end, Isildur was attempting to give up the ring, to deliver to Elrond in Imladris, where he was tragically killed on the way there. Isildur showed no signs of corruption. He wished to keep the ring to begin with. That's not really corruption. It's all but impossible to cast it away, much less destroy it. And neither he nor Elrond really knew its true nature at the time when they had their discussion, which was not like in the movie, by the way. They didn't go into the volcano and go to Samath Nar, and Elrond says, destroy it, cast it in the fire, and then Isildur looks at the camera and says, no, that didn't happen. What happened was, it was more like Elrond saw Isildur there after Sauron was defeated, and Elendil is dead, and Gil-galad is dying, and he says, what do you have there? And he says, this is this ring, I got it off of Sauron. He says, I don't know, Sauron's ring, that seems kind of evil. Should probably destroy it, toss it in the fire. And Isildur thought about it for a moment. He said, no, I think I'll keep it. It'll be Weirgild for my father and my brother. His brother had also been killed about a year prior. when they had the siege of Barad-dûr, somebody, it could have been Sauron, it could have been anybody, somebody in the Dark Tower threw an object of some sort down, and it struck Anarion in the head, and he died. And then, of course, Elendil died fighting Sauron, so Isildur lost his father, lost his brother, and this is his Weirgild, the price of blood, basically. He didn't really know what it was at the time. If he had known its nature, he probably would have attempted at least to destroy it, but he probably wouldn't have been able to. It's just that seductive. Boromir, you could say, was corrupted by the ring. He was the spiritual weak point in the Fellowship, and over time he became obsessed with the ring. But it was not really instant. It wasn't until they left Lothlorien when Boromir started to act funny, and then he didn't attempt to take it right away, but he tried to convince Frodo to follow him to Minas Tirith. Frodo's refusal had him try to take the ring by force, but once Frodo left the scene, he came to his senses. Now, a great question that I got once asked or postulated a theory and asked if I agreed with it, which I suppose I do. I hadn't thought of it before then, but it was a great theory, that previously Boromir had been shielded from the One Ring by the three. Elrond had his ring in Imladris, and then Gandalf was traveling with them, and he had another one of the three rings, and then they were in Lothlorien with Galadriel. So once outside of that protection, he gets the full blast of seduction. But it wasn't instant. If it was instant, he wouldn't have tried to talk Frodo into following him to Minas Tirith. He probably would have just snuck up on Frodo and killed him, and then taken the ring and disappeared and gone to Minas Tirith. So I can hardly say that men get instantly corrupted by the ring. It really doesn't work that way. The only character that I could say was instantly corrupted by the ring was Sméagol, who was a hobbit, a remigrant store, and Sméagol he didn't have a very far to fall. He wasn't a great king like Isildur. He wasn't a really good person like Bilbo or Frodo would be. He was a nasty little jerk, and he was very quick to kill his friend and to become corrupted in that sense, because he didn't have far to go. He was already on that path, so to speak. Bilbo's a good guy. The ring did make him lie about how he got the ring, and he didn't really have a reason to. Nobody would have cared if he told the truth. Nobody would have been like, well, you stole that, because he didn't really steal it. He found it. He found it lying on the ground. Frodo, he was unable to actually go through with destroying the ring, but nobody could have actually gone through with destroying it. Gollum was sort of key there because he had a part to play. So the hobbits generally are pretty resistant to the One Ring because the One Ring doesn't have much to offer them, because they're not generally ambitious. They're not looking to rule. They're not looking for great kingdoms. When Sam held the ring, the only vision he got was that he was Samwise the Brave riding a great horse and turning all of Middle-earth into a garden. And he rejected this because that's not really what he wanted. He didn't want to turn all of Middle-earth into a garden. He wanted a little bit of garden that was his own, that he could tend to in the Shire. And boy, did he get that. So yeah, not through the One Ring, but through going home, and he had the nut of the Malorn tree from Galadriel, and he was very involved in replenishing the Shire from the damage Saruman had done to it. But anyway, guys, that is all the questions that we have today. Send me some good ones. I got a lot of good ones this week. We'll hopefully get another lot of good ones next week. Link is in the description to Quora once again. And if you got all the way through the video, I'm assuming that you enjoyed it. The channel has been growing, and thank you so much for that. Leave me some comments. Hit the thumbs up if you haven't already. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so. Share the channel around with anybody that you think might enjoy it. We'll see you guys next week.